rise of Reform UK means there is now a significant player on the right of politics that isn't tainted by the immediate past, and obviously has in someone like Nigel Farage, whatever one thinks of Nigel Farage, as someone who now has a pulpit as a member of Parliament to be able to drive things forward.
We speak to former Tory MP Mark Field about his love affair with Liz Truss, what he thinks about her premiership, whether Kemi cuts it when it comes to leading the Tories, and his thoughts on Trump and Putin. We're joined now by the former Conservative MP Mark Field, who served the cities of London and Westminster constituency from 2001 to 2019. And you've written this tell-all memoir. I do love the cover, which is a cartoon depiction of David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, all sort of in I would say a scene of total and utter Tory chaos.
Well,
there,
it did seem like that. I mean, I left Parliament in 2019, but it did seem exactly like that, I'm afraid.
The wheels slightly came off. Now, we're going to do the nettle grasping at the very beginning of this interview, because the book is 400 plus pages.
Yes.
You devote 10 to the affair that you had with the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Can we speak about that?
It's very sweet of you to point that out. Listen, I mean, it was actually Philip Hammond, who's an old friend, the former Chancellor, who said to me, "Mark, you do get into a hell of a lot of scrapes," and I'm afraid that isn't the only one, of course, that is documented in the book. But yes, I mean, it's an important part. I mean, it's something I hadn't spoken about before, and I hope it was written in a very dignified and respectful way. There's no sort of kiss and tell element at all.
No, it's very
but equally,
respectful.
I did know Elizabeth Truss before she was an MP. Obviously, we knew each other fairly well for a short period of time, and some of the facets that I saw then, I think, were reflected in the way she was Prime Minister. And people often ask, did I think she had the capacity to be Prime Minister? And my answer is sort of yes and no. She had the ambition, the drive, the raw intelligence. She's a highly intelligent lady. But there were also aspects, I think, of her personality that meant that it didn't surprise me unduly that it was a very short-lived premiership.
Are you still in touch now?
No, I mean, obviously we were when we were colleagues in the House, but I left Parliament 5 years ago, and I've gone back into the world of business, really. And so writing this book was something I always had in mind. I mean, partly, I've got 2 teenage children. I am a footnote in public life to that extent, but I've had an interesting parliamentary life and indeed life before that in business and in the law and the like. And so that's really what the element of the book is about.
And before we move on from that period, what do you think is most misunderstood about Liz Truss?
Listen, as I say, I wouldn't go into great. Well, I think the one thing I have said is I do believe that she is a highly intelligent person. I mean, she's obviously no longer in Parliament, no longer has a platform in British politics, but obviously is doing quite a lot on the global scene with the rise of Donald Trump and his second coming in the US.
And when we look at this cover with all of these successive Tory Prime Ministers, which is nuts, really, if you consider that the period that you were an MP and how many PMs we actually had.
Sure.
I mean, we look at the Tory party now. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch's doing her best to repair things, that catastrophic, historic defeat of last July. When you look at these figures in front of you, who do you think bears most of the responsibility for where things went wrong?
Listen, I wouldn't necessarily put it in that way. I mean, I think I felt for Rishi Sunak because I think he had an impossibly difficult task, given what had come before. I had a lot of respect for Rishi. I think he's an extremely hard-working, diligent guy. I mean, the elements of that diligence weren't there in some of his predecessors, and I think you have to be.
Who are you referring to there, Mark?
I think we know all too well whom that might be referring to. But no, I mean, the broader issue in my book really is, and I said, I have just turned 60, so I'm just a baby boomer. I was born in October 1964, and it is with some regret and a bit of guilt and melancholy that I look back on my time in public life and think what a mess my generation made of it. We had it all. We didn't have to go into the army through national service or go to war. I was able to get a university education free of charge, came out without debt, was able to get on the housing ladder almost immediately. We had great careers of our generation. And again, the contrast between how I feel as someone born in the first half of the 1960s and the life that my teenage children have. I've got a son of 17 and a daughter of 14. It's a lot tougher, and it's fairly lamentable, I think, the legacy that we've passed on. So there's a lot of that and elements of why that has all come to pass. And I think one of the other factors, and I say it as a very proud British citizen. I mean, my late mother was German, my father was in the army, but I think there's a sense of exceptionalism that we have in the UK that is now unwarranted, and I think that's part of what is holding us back. And again, that's an intergenerational thing. I think people of my generation still think Britain rules the waves, and I was a Foreign Office minister, and I know how exciting it is to go to the UN Security Council. And of course, much of the apparatus of modern-day diplomacy was really set in stone in 1945, and that I think is going to have to change. And I think that sense of exceptionalism has been a big problem for many Conservative leaders, not least because our pandering to the history and traditions of this country is something that is very much part of the DNA for the Conservative Party. And one of the things I reflect on about the change, and obviously with Keir Starmer coming in, and again, he's someone I knew fairly well in his 20s, and we were at the same college, at the same university, reading the same subject. He was doing a postgraduate in law when I was an undergraduate at St Edmund Hall in the mid-1980s. And I think he is a much underestimated figure. And he's had a very difficult baptism of fire in the first 6 or 7 months as Premier. But by the same token, I think he has a big majority. He's got time on his side, at least 4 years now till the next general election. And I think that many people, Conservatives and beyond, do underestimate him. And in many ways, it may well be that he is the sort of person that is slightly, his whole tenor and the way he behaves is very similar to what it was like at university politics. But I think that it may be that he's the person who can help the UK brush off its sense of exceptionalism. And as I say, I certainly think, in a post-Brexit era, when you talk to youngsters in this country, people in their 20s and 30s, they don't have a sense of Britain rules the waves. Their view is, well, we're a medium-sized European nation. We have a great capital city, we've got a great sense of history. But I think they're very relaxed at the idea that Britain in their lifetime might be like Portugal or the Netherlands is, former big empire states that obviously are now smaller European states within the EU.
Mark, listening to you, you sound almost more sympathetic, more supportive of Keir Starmer than you maybe are of the Conservative Party. Am I not hearing you quite right, I'm assuming?
No, I'm a lifelong Conservative. I can imagine, as I say in my book, I was a grammar school boy, and that's what really galvanised me. And if there's one thing that irritates me, it's the politics of envy and class war rhetoric, and I think elements of the VAT on the school fees is part and parcel of that. So, no, I know exactly where my politics are. But I would say I am a small state, low tax, meritocratic Tory. I was very, as you'll probably gather, was brought up during the Thatcher era. I'm a great admirer of Margaret Thatcher. The world has moved on, and I'm not suggesting that the party needs to look back for that. But equally, I think there are some principles of conservatism that have perhaps been forgotten in recent years. And I think in particular, and I've felt this particularly as a minister, the careful husbandry of the public finances, diligent administration. And I think, again, the heart of that, as you'll gather, I was very much a big Remainer, and I think that Brexit has been a very bad policy. It's not just its implementation. I think at the outset it was very clear that the Singapore-on-Thames type Brexit that some had in mind was a non-starter, given the nature of our economy. And no one really thought through what we were going to do as far as Brexit was concerned. And I do think it's geopolitically been very bad news for the UK. And I'm afraid it has exposed some of the vulnerabilities that I've referred to earlier.
Many might argue, though, that our position now outside the European Union is incredibly useful, given that Donald Trump is in the White House. But maybe we'll come on to Donald Trump a little bit later in our conversation. But I just want to jump back to Camilla's question. You've talked about there your belief in the principles of conservatism. When did the rot set in conservatism that they got so wiped out last year? Did it start with, is it Boris Johnson? Is it Theresa May? Because it was Boris Johnson. Two things on Boris Johnson were expenditure and migration. And the Conservatives seem to lose control of the idea of properly husbanded public finances and control of the borders. Is he the person to blame for the Conservatives' disaster of last year?
I think certainly as things were set in stone. The reality, of course, was the 2019 victory, and unexpectedly on a single issue election on getting Brexit done, meant that our support was very thin and very shallow, and it was always going to be difficult to replicate that at subsequent elections, I think, with the red wall seats, almost all of which ended up being lost. I would argue, and I have obviously out of Parliament given more thought to this, and it's not about pointing the blame, but I think part of the problem, as I saw it, was when there was a lack of authenticity, I think, to the Cameron offering. It was my criticism at the time, because I'm very much a modernising sort of Conservative, not least given the fact that I represented a central London seat where more than half of my constituents were born outside the UK, including myself, as it happens, born in a British military hospital in Germany. But I think that was where the core of the problem came into play, and it was ironic, actually, that when the great appeal of Cameron in 2005, when he became party leader, was very much, I'm the heir to Blair, just at the very moment when I think the rest of the country seemed to be falling out of love with Blair after the Iraq War. But also, I mean, as Conservatives, our gods didn't fail. And one of the reasons that New Labour came into being was the idea that old-fashioned socialism had failed, and there needed to be a new approach for Labour. And I think we learnt the wrong lessons of the rise of Blair. And I think then we had the coalition, and it's very easy, and I do say this in my book, and I wasn't a part of the coalition, so I could only speak as an observer from afar, but I think it's very easy to lionize the coalition years. I mean, particularly, I guess, with what came afterwards, and think, oh, wasn't that marvellous and stable? But in many ways, I think too much of the can was being kicked into the future. And what happened was, whether it was social care, energy capacity, the housing problems, all of these issues, they were challenges that we knew were there in 2010. And in many ways, the easy solution, partly it was a function of the coalition, was, oh, well, we'll have a public inquiry on this, or we'll have another review on this, or let's have this commission. And essentially all of those challenges, which were well known a decade and a half ago, are now massive crises because nothing was done during what seemed to be a stable period of government.
I'm thinking back to your comment about Cameron, and was it a kind of accurate representation of sort of Thatcherite conservatism? I mean, we can point at the likes of Cameron, Osborne, maybe May, and sort of describe them as wet Tories. You then throw Brexit and Remain into the mix, as you say, you were an ardent Remainer. That then causes a huge division down the middle of the party. Yeah. Is it perhaps the case, Mark, that it's very difficult, and we can move on to Kemi Badenoch with this in mind, to align different kinds of Tories who on one hand are stridently right-wing, who say that they don't want to be in the ECHR, that they think there should be a cap on migration, versus those who might be more of a kind of, open borders and let's be the heir to Blair and, let's actually give people more welfare, for instance.
Well, I don't think there are many of the second category left in today's Tory party, but that's a function of being down to 121 seats,
I know,
I guess.
But then people say actually still the One Nationers are the consensus of the party, and people look at Robert Jenrick and go, oh, well, you're sticking out on the right like a sore thumb. So I don't think there are more righties left than so-called wets in the party now, Mark. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think the issue in part, of course, is our electoral system. We have a first-past-the-post system, so actually all parties have, in the UK system, tended to be coalitions under one roof. Yeah. And when one element of that coalition becomes overly strong, that's normally quite bad news. So the Conservative Party has been the party of the countryside, the party of financial services in the city, and the party of tradition, which, of course, in many European models would be in 2 or 3 separate parties that would more often than not come together in coalition. And so, that I think is one of the great challenges for the Conservatives, obviously, is to try to hold together. And of course, the rise of Reform UK means there is now a significant player on the right of politics that isn't tainted by the immediate past, and obviously has in someone like Nigel Farage, whatever one thinks of Nigel Farage, someone who now has a pulpit as a member of Parliament to be able to drive things forward.
How should the Conservatives respond to Nigel Farage? Should there be a Unite the Right movement? Will the Conservatives have to make some kind of deal with Reform to have any chance of success at local elections, but particularly the national elections in 4 years' time?
To be honest, Kamal, I don't know, and I think we're all very much in the dark on that, and a lot of this will depend on how events all play out. I think it would be unwise to invest all of our energies in looking just at how we bring Reform UK on board in some form or other, whether there's a deal done electorally, I don't know. But the other thing that happened, of course, at the last election was the Liberal Democrats got more seats than they've had at any general election for over 100 years. And if you look at the seats they won, I mean, particularly down in the home counties, there were a cluster of seats there they didn't even win in their good days, under Paddy Ashdown or Charles Kennedy. and they're going to be very difficult to dislodge. And I think not least because as Labour has got more unpopular, there's still sizable Labour votes in many of those sorts of constituencies, which I think can be squeezed and are likely to be squeezed in the Liberal Democrats' favour. They're also very good local campaigners. They're like knotweed. Once they're in, they're difficult to get rid of. And obviously, the one exception to that was the 2015 election, when they were tainted, of course, by being part and parcel of a coalition. So, in many ways, a lot of energy has to be expended on that for the Conservative thoughts as well. And I think that is the key electoral challenge that we face, is that the risk of trying to appeal to one group rather than another might end up with another whole raft of seats going. I mean, the Liberal Democrats, made tremendous progress at the last election. I think only Jeremy Hunt in Godalming and Ash was the only one of their target seats they didn't win, and they won another 15 or so on top of their 50 targets. But they evidently still have quite a few other Tories in their sights, all in seats, I suspect, where there is a reasonably sized Labour vote, which could be squeezed quite badly.
Is Kemi Bade not cutting it, or would Robert Jenrick be better as leader?
I don't know. Listen, I'm not the best person to ask on these matters,
You
because
must
I
have
know
an
I have a
opinion on these
100%
matters,
failure
Mark.
record on voting for the wrong candidate. I voted for the losing candidate each and every time, from Ken Clarke to.
Did you have a vote
to
in the
David
last
Davis.
leadership?
I did. Fun enough, I wasn't terribly enamoured by either of the candidates, but Robert.
Who would you have preferred?
Well, I did vote for Robert Jenrick. I mean, I voted for him simply because partly because I know him partly personally. We had children at the same school at one time, so we were there at the school gates, and he was actually a former ward chairman of mine in my association. But I understand why many people were slightly concerned by what seemed to be a volte-face from what seemed to be very conventional Cameroon Conservative when he arrived in Parliament in 2014 to what he's ended up being since. But he has a clear view on the reform issue. Now, how that would play out, I don't know. But evidently, it is one of the big strategic cephalogical issues that the Tory party has to face.
So the last time we were together was at the 2019 Mansion House speech, a very grand affair in central London. But that one became particularly famous because there was a demonstration during it. I think it was about 40 Greenpeace activists suddenly stood up amongst the black-tied and beautifully gown-wearing audience and started hollering about climate change. And you, rather briskly, to put it maybe it's most polite, escorted one of the women out and then became an absolute social media internet sensation and ended up actually losing your ministerial post.
Well, I was suspended, and then obviously there was a change of leadership that was in play, so it wasn't on that issue at all. It is all set out in the book, and I mean, obviously you were there, Kamal, so you'll remember that there were, as I say, lots of protesters and actually quite a lot of other people who were intervening as well, as it happened. But of course, the camera got hold of.
You were filmed, and I think you were escorting, and also you had your hand on the back of her neck was the issue, wasn't it?
Listen, the issue really was you had a protester who was rushing forward. I had no idea it was an environmental protest at the time. It was, you'll recall that they arrived, there were rape alarms going off, klaxons. It was actually quite a frightening situation. And I'd been to quite a lot of Mansion House dinners over the years, and so realised quite quickly there was something was amiss as far as the security was concerned. And the interesting thing, actually, Kamal, was obviously it became a social media furore, and I got home at about 11 o'clock that night and thinking no more of it. I thought, well, that was all fine, and suddenly this furore happened. But very quickly, everything turned. I mean, within a few hours of the furore beginning, suddenly there was a massive support for what I'd done. And I think that whenever I speak to constituents, and it does get brought up from time to time, and I must confess I always wince when I hear something of a Mansion House thing, but it's always in the context, understandably perhaps talking to me, of support for what I did. And I think people have realised we've seen 2 MPs actually being murdered in doing their work, in Joe Cox and David Amos. And of course all the disruption, people have had a bit of enough of it. I mean, I think the view is, listen, it is fair enough to intervene, and that certainly was the view of the police. I mean, literally the issue was closed within 3 days. They looked at all the CCTV footage and took witness responses. So it was it was not a pleasant thing to have to go through.
Just before we come to the end of this interview, let's go full circle and back to Liz Truss. Just on the politics of it, no, not on your relationship with her, but on the politics of it. You describe her as quirky, refuse to be told what to do, open to maverick ideas. Whether you agree or disagree with her politics and her economic policies, isn't that just the kind of person that that you need to disrupt politics. What Farage has done is he is a disruptor. What is Donald Trump? He's a disruptor. What do the public want? They want disruptors. Just tell us a bit more about Liz Truss and her ability to disrupt. And don't the Conservatives and, frankly, the establishment need a bit of that?
Maybe you need a bit of disruption. I think you also need good administration. And I think, as I say, I was obviously looking at this from afar. I was no longer in Parliament in 2022 during her brief tenure in Downing Street. And my impression was that she needed to surround herself with people who took a different view as well. And it's all very well to be a disruptor. And as I say, we're seeing this in the US, and you rightly point out, I was a Foreign Office Minister during Trump Mark I, when there was some somewhat quixotic approach towards diplomacy that was even evident then. And I think the one lesson that Trump learnt from 4 years out was how he was going to hit the ground running when he came back into office to do the disruption that he looked to do. And yes, I think there are a lot of people who are willing to vote for disruption. In many ways, Brexit was a vote for that precisely in June of 2016 here in the UK as well. They might vote for it, but you actually need to have a plan, and that plan has to be within the framework of the institutions that you've got in place. So, as I say, all well and good to have disruptors who are there. For example, I'm watching with great interest what's happening, obviously, in Ukraine. It was something that close to my heart, having got Eastern European or Central European blood in my veins. My late mother was from Breslau, or now Wrocław in Poland. And, I think the country has to be softened up for what the likely outcome is going to be. And I think we're going to have a frozen conflict there. I mean, war does not always end in peace, as we've seen in the past. And I think, you're going to find Ukraine, which is a very badly divided country. And I think, to be brutally honest, I think the mistake that we made with Ukraine 25, 30 years ago was leaving open the idea that they could join the West. And I don't think they were or are a suitable candidate for NATO, and certainly, obviously, if it ends up as a divided country, then that won't be the case. And it's interesting. I do quite a lot of work now with a European Investment Fund, and I've been out a few times to Lithuania in recent months. And I speak to people there, political and business people. People who are fairly sophisticated, have thoughts on these matters. And whilst some are very much totally pro-Ukraine, there's a very small Russian population in Lithuania compared to Latvia or Estonia. But while some are very pro-Ukraine, others take the view, hang on a minute, Article 5, the protection under for NATO, has to mean something. And if that Article 5 is diluted, you're as strong as your weakest link. And so many of those countries, I think, don't take a view necessarily that they would want Ukraine to join NATO. They want to play their part in warding off Russia. But there's also just a feeling that I'm afraid this is likely to be a conflict that is not going to be solved. Hopefully we'll have ceasefire soon, but I don't think it's going to be solved anytime soon.
Do you think Trump is taking the right approach then?
I think something needed to be done, and funny enough, yes, I do. Broad. I mean, listen, I think one has to start from the position that Putin is a terrible. It runs a dreadful country, but I think one has to remember the American view. They look at what's happened in Ukraine. Remember the first few months there was always a sense from Zelensky saying, "Listen, one more push, give us a bit more money, and we can win this war." And they've seen now 3 years of a quagmire. And I'm afraid, because the American view is look back at Vietnam. This is exactly what happened. Military leaders in 64 and 65, just give us one more push and we'll get this sorted. So there's that worry. The other thing, to be brutally honest, is I think that behind it, a lot of the security services in America now look upon Putin and think, well, he's been badly damaged by what has happened. I mean, he was the guy who was going to win over Ukraine in double quick time. It hasn't happened. But the truth of the matter is, if Putin goes, he's not going to be replaced by some Democrat. He's more likely to be replaced by an even bigger hardliner with all that nuclear arsenal but behind him. So I think the view, I suspect, from the security services in America, incidentally, I don't have any inside knowledge on this. This is just my supposition. But the view I suspect there is, we don't want to get into another Vietnam, so we need to get this thing solved, get a ceasefire. But with Putin in place and diminished by being in place, that probably is the not the ideal, but it's the most optimal outcome given the circumstances we're in.
Friends closer, enemies closer. Mark Field, The End of an Era, your book, The Decline and Fall of the Tory Party, is out
Well,
now.
it says a little bit more than just that, which is very, very
No,
sweet of you.
it does. Although that's just the front cover
No,
that I'm reading.
it says
off.
more in it, I'm saying.
It says a lot more in it, and there's photographs. Oh, look, there's you as a boy. There's lots of photographs, and there's lots of very, very juicy stories in here, and it's been endorsed by a number of key journalists on the back, including Andrew Neil and others. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Daily Tea.
Camilla, Kamal, thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark.